On a quiet Halloween night in 2020, in the small, close-knit town of Hemphill, Texas, a life full of promise came to a sudden and brutal end. 19-year-old Livye Lewis, a bright and compassionate young woman, was discovered lifeless in her car, a single gunshot wound to her neck extinguishing a future brimming with hope. She wasn't just another victim. Livye was a beacon of kindness, a nursing assistant who had dedicated her young life to caring for others. Her dream was to heal, to make a difference, to leave her mark on the world through love and care. Her tragic death sent shockwaves through the community, not only because of its senselessness, but because of the chilling details that soon emerged. The town wasn't just mourning the loss of Livye, they were grappling with the revelation that someone she once trusted may have been the one to betray her in the worst possible way. Her former boyfriend, Matthew Edgar, a man she had loved and feared in equal measure, became the central figure in an unfolding nightmare. This wasn't just a story about love gone wrong or small-town secrets. It was about obsession, jealousy, and rage, emotions that had simmered just beneath the surface until they exploded in the most horrifying way imaginable. The texts, the threats, and the chilling behavior in the hours leading up to Livye's death painted a picture too disturbing to ignore. But this story isn't just about Livye's death. It's about the impact of her life and the relentless pursuit of justice that followed. A town united in grief was left with questions no one wanted to ask. How could this happen here? And who, if anyone, could have stopped it? What unfolded next would reveal the darker side of relationships, the limits of trust, and the strength of a mother determined to uncover the truth. This is the story of Livye Lewis, and it's one that demands to be told. It began as a day like any other in Hemphill, Texas, a small town where everyone knew everyone, where streets were lined with familiarity and trust. But by the early hours of Halloween morning in 2020, the community was shaken by a tragedy so profound that it would leave an indelible mark on their hearts. On that fateful morning, 19-year-old Livye Lewis was found in her car, lifeless, slumped over the steering wheel. Her dreams of a career in medicine, her kind spirit, and her love for life were stolen by a single gunshot wound to the neck. The darkness of that night was nothing compared to the shadows that the investigation would soon uncover. Livye was more than just another small-town girl. She was driven, compassionate, and mature beyond her years. From an early age, she knew she wanted to care for others, and that passion led her to become a certified nursing assistant. Her work at the local nursing home was more than a job. It was her calling. Residents adored her for her kindness and gentle spirit. Livye was the kind of person who brought light to the lives she touched, making the loss even harder to bear. Her life took a complicated turn when she became romantically involved with 23-year-old Matthew Edgar. He wasn't an obvious match for her, but Livye, ever compassionate, saw something in him that she believed was worth her time and heart. What began as a secret relationship soon spiraled into something toxic. Matthew, who was still married when they met, had a history of instability and questionable choices. Despite her youth, Livye found herself drawn into his world, a world that was chaotic, volatile, and ultimately dangerous. For months, Livye juggled her life as a student, her job, and a relationship that seemed to grow darker with time. Matthew's erratic behavior was fueled by jealousy and alcohol, turning moments of affection into terrifying outbursts. Text messages would later reveal the abuse she endured. She confided in close friends about his violence, showing evidence of bruises and injuries. Despite warnings from those who cared about her, Livye held on to hope that the man she loved could change. It was the hope of someone who believed in the goodness of others, even when it came at her own expense. As the months passed, Matthew's grip on her tightened. He was not only emotionally manipulative, but also physically controlling. Livye, however, was no ordinary victim. She was strong and determined to reclaim her life. She made plans to move forward, to leave behind the chaos and start anew. She had dreams of attending college, of becoming a physician's assistant, of building a life that was hers alone. But the ties to Matthew were not so easily severed. Their small-town life meant they crossed paths frequently, and his presence was a constant reminder of the danger she faced. On the night of October 30th, 2020, Livye attended a party at a mutual friend's house. It was a chance to unwind, to feel normal for a few hours. But Matthew was there too, and tensions simmered beneath the surface. Witnesses would later recall his brooding demeanor, his eyes following Livy as she tried to enjoy herself. When Livy decided to stay overnight at the party, it was the spark that ignited Matthew's already volatile emotions. What followed was a series of events that would leave a community grappling with grief and unanswered questions. Matthew's anger boiled over as the night wore on. He left the party only to return moments later, consumed by rage. Witnesses described his violent outbursts, his threats, and his erratic behavior. Livy and others attempted to defuse the situation, but it was clear that Matthew was spiraling out of control. When Livy left the party in her car, she couldn't have known that it would be the last time anyone would see her alive. In the hours that followed, chaos unfolded. Phone records revealed chilling text messages between Matthew and his ex-wife Montana, who had been a complex figure in his and Livy's lives. The texts hinted at jealousy, rage, and a growing sense of despair. Montana herself had a tangled relationship with both Matthew and Livy, one that investigators would later scrutinize closely. But as those messages flew back and forth, one chilling fact emerged. Matthew had declared that Livy was dead. When Livy's car was discovered on the side of the road, the scene was a grim testament to what had transpired. Her body, slumped and lifeless, bore the evidence of a single, deliberate act. Nearby, Matthew was found lying in a fetal position, covered in blood but uninjured. His clothes, his demeanor, and the rifle at the scene all pointed to him as the primary suspect. Yet when questioned, Matthew claimed to have no memory of what had happened. The discovery of Livy's body was the beginning of a case that would unravel layers of betrayal, obsession, and violence. Investigators pieced together a timeline of events, uncovering a story that was as heartbreaking as it was horrifying. In the days that followed, Livy's friends and family were left grappling with their loss, while the community sought justice for a young woman whose life had been stolen far too soon. This was not just the story of a murder, it was the story of a young woman whose light was extinguished by someone she once trusted. Livy's death was a devastating reminder of how quickly love can turn to obsession and how dangerous it is when that obsession spirals out of control. Her memory would become a rallying cry for justice, and her story would serve as a cautionary tale of the darkness that can hide in the most unexpected places. The morning after Halloween 2020, the sun rose over Hemphill, Texas, but the town was cloaked in a somber haze. News of Livy Lewis's death had spread like wildfire, leaving a community reeling. As her family and friends tried to make sense of the tragedy, law enforcement began piecing together the puzzle of what had happened. The crime scene was a grim and confusing sight. Livy's lifeless body was found in her car, the wound to her neck leaving no question about the deliberate violence that had ended her life. Nearby, Matthew Edgar was discovered lying on the ground in a fetal position, his face smeared with blood, his clothes disheveled, and his truck parked nearby. For the investigators, this was just the beginning of a case that would expose the dark underbelly of seemingly ordinary lives. Matthew, who was immediately taken into custody, claimed to have no memory of what had happened. He admitted to being at the scene, but offered no explanation for the blood on his face or the rifle found near the car. His vague and evasive statements raised more questions than answers. How could someone have no memory of such a horrific event? And if he didn't pull the trigger, who did? The case quickly became a whirlwind of theories and speculation, fueled by the tangled relationships that surrounded Matthew and Livy. Investigators discovered that Livy's death was not just an isolated act of violence, but the culmination of a toxic and tumultuous relationship. Matthew's ex-wife Montana emerged as a key figure in the unfolding drama. Her unusual closeness to Livy, despite being her romantic rival, raised eyebrows. It was a relationship that many found puzzling. Some speculated that Montana's attempts to befriend Livy were driven by jealousy or ulterior motives, while others believed she was caught in the same cycle of manipulation as Livy had been. As law enforcement began reconstructing the night of the murder, a clearer picture started to emerge. Witnesses at the party described Matthew's erratic behavior and explosive temper. He had been drinking heavily and appeared consumed by jealousy and anger. When Livy announced she would be staying at the party overnight, it seemed to ignite something dark within him. His rage spilled over, and he lashed out at those around him. Witnesses recalled him shouting threats, smashing objects, and spiraling into a fit of uncontrollable anger. But it wasn't just his behavior at the party that raised red flags. Investigators uncovered a series of text messages sent in the hours leading up to Livye's death. These messages painted a chilling portrait of a man unraveling. Matthew's texts to Montana were filled with accusations, threats, and a disturbing fixation on Livye. At one point, he declared that Livye was dead, a statement that would later be scrutinized as both an admission and a motive. What made the case even more perplexing were the inconsistencies in Matthew's account of the night. He claimed to have blacked out after drinking a bottle of whiskey, yet he managed to send coherent text messages, drive to multiple locations, and end up at the scene of the crime. His claims of memory loss were contradicted by evidence that placed him at the heart of the tragedy. The blood on his face, while not identified as Livye's, was still a critical piece of the puzzle. And the rifle, which investigators confirmed belonged to him, was the weapon that ended Livye's life. As the investigation deepened, Montana's role came under scrutiny. She admitted to being in contact with Matthew throughout the night, but denied having any involvement in Livye's death. Her failure to alert authorities after receiving Matthew's alarming texts was a point of contention. Why hadn't she called 911? Why had she waited until morning to act? These questions cast a shadow of suspicion over her, but no concrete evidence linked her to the crime scene. Still, the tangled web of relationships, secrets, and motives made it difficult for investigators to untangle the truth. The physical evidence at the scene provided some answers, but left gaps that would prove challenging to fill. The rifle, while clearly the murder weapon, had not been tested for fingerprints or DNA. This oversight became a critical point of contention, with Matthew's defense team later arguing that it weakened the case against him. Additionally, DNA samples from the crime scene included traces of another unknown male, further complicating the narrative. These unanswered questions left room for doubt, even as the case against Matthew seemed overwhelming. For Livye's family, the search for justice was both heartbreaking and infuriating. Her mother, Darcy Bass, was determined to see her daughter's killer held accountable. She pored over every detail of the case, refusing to let her grief silence her voice. Darcy's resilience became a driving force in the pursuit of justice, but it was a painful journey. Every piece of evidence, every revelation was a reminder of the daughter she had lost and the life that had been stolen from them. As the legal process moved forward, Matthew's behavior continued to raise alarms. While out on bond awaiting trial, he showed no signs of remorse or accountability. He interacted with members of the community as if nothing had happened, even crossing paths with Darcy at a local store. For Darcy, this encounter was a moment of raw emotion. She confronted him, demanding answers and accusing him of taking her daughter's life. Her pain was palpable, a testament to the depth of her loss. The stage was set for a trial that would attempt to bring closure to a community and justice for Livye. But the road ahead was far from straightforward. With questions about the evidence, gaps in the timeline, and Matthew's own evasive tactics, still, one thing was certain. Livye Lewis deserved justice, and those who loved her would stop at nothing to ensure her voice was heard. As the community braced for the trial, the weight of Livye's story hung heavy in the air. It wasn't just about one young woman's tragic death. It was about the darkness that can lurk behind closed doors, the danger of unchecked anger, and the devastating consequences of a love that turns into obsession. For Livye's family and friends, the fight for justice was a way to honor her memory and ensure that her story would not be forgotten. As the trial for Matthew Edgar approached, the community of Hemphill found itself at the center of a chilling and deeply personal tragedy. Livye Lewis's murder had already shattered lives and raised questions that felt impossible to answer. But the courtroom would become the stage where the search for justice would collide with raw emotion, contested evidence, and the haunting presence of a man accused of ending a life so full of promise. For months, Livye's family had waited for this moment, clinging to the hope that the trial would bring clarity and accountability. The prosecution built its case meticulously, relying on the pieces of evidence that tied Matthew to the crime. They highlighted his erratic behavior, the disturbing texts sent in the hours leading up to Livye's death, and the rifle that matched the fatal shot, a weapon that was undeniably his. Livye's blood was found on his clothing, albeit in a minute quantity, but it was enough to place him at the scene of her death. The state painted a picture of a man consumed by jealousy, spiraling into uncontrollable rage, and ultimately acting on his darkest impulses. For Livye's loved ones, sitting through the proceedings was an emotional ordeal. They listened as her final moments were dissected in detail, each piece of evidence a painful reminder of what had been taken from them. The texts between Matthew and Montana were particularly damning, laying bare the storm of emotions that raged within him on the night of the murder. His threats were chilling in their specificity, and his admission that Livye was dead left little doubt in the minds of those seeking justice. Yet despite the overwhelming evidence, there were still gaps that Matthew's defense seized upon. His attorney argued that the prosecution's case was circumstantial, lacking the definitive proof needed to convict. The rifle, the most critical piece of evidence, had not been tested for fingerprints or DNA. This oversight was a glaring hole in the investigation, one that the defense used to sow doubt in the minds of the jury. Matthew's attorney also pointed to the presence of another man's DNA at the scene, a discovery that raised questions about who else might have been involved. Matthew himself was a wild card in the courtroom. He maintained that he had no memory of the events surrounding Livye's death, a claim that seemed both convenient and implausible. His demeanor was stoic, almost detached, as he listened to the evidence against him. For Livye's family, his lack of visible remorse was infuriating. They struggled to reconcile the man they saw in court with the one Livye had once loved, a man who had been a part of their lives in ways both good and bad. The trial took a dramatic turn when Matthew failed to show up for court one morning. He had been released on bond months earlier, despite the severity of the charges against him, a decision that had left Livye's family outraged. His absence was initially met with confusion, but it quickly became clear that he had fled. The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom and the community. How had this been allowed to happen? And where was he now? The search for Matthew became a manhunt that spanned weeks, with law enforcement agencies working tirelessly to track him down. For Livye's family, the news of his flight was a devastating blow. They had already endured so much, and now it seemed that justice was slipping through their fingers. Darcy Bass, Livye's mother, took matters into her own hands, plastering the town with homemade wanted posters and urging anyone with information to come forward. Her determination was unwavering, fueled by a deep love for her daughter and a refusal to let her story end in injustice. Despite the setback, the trial continued in Matthew's absence. The jury was not informed of his flight, but his absence spoke volumes. The prosecution pressed forward, focusing on the evidence that painted Matthew as the only plausible suspect. Witnesses recounted his threats, his violent tendencies, and his jealousy-fueled rage. The timeline of events, supported by phone records and witness statements, left little room for alternative theories. The defense, now without their client, faced an uphill battle. They continued to argue that the evidence was insufficient, pointing to the lack of physical proof directly tying Matthew to the act of pulling the trigger. They questioned the integrity of the investigation, highlighting the oversights and gaps that left lingering doubts. But for many, these arguments felt hollow in the face of the overwhelming narrative that had emerged. A narrative of a man consumed by his emotions, unable to control the anger that ultimately led to a young woman's death. The jury deliberated for just over an hour before returning with their verdict, guilty of murder. It was a moment of relief for Livye's family, a step toward justice in a case that had taken so much from them. But the victory was bittersweet. Matthew was still on the run, and his absence cast a shadow over the proceedings. For Darcy and those who loved Livye, the verdict was not enough. They needed to see him held accountable, to know that he would face the consequences of his actions. Months passed with no sign of Matthew. Rumors swirled in Hempel, each one more unsettling than the last. Some claimed he had fled the state, while others believed he was hiding in plain sight. The uncertainty was agonizing for Livye's family, who were left to wonder if they would ever see justice fully served. The case had already exposed the cracks in the system. The decision to release Matthew on bond, the failures in the investigation, and the challenges of pursuing justice in a small town where everyone knew everyone. For Darcy, the fight was far from over. She became a relentless advocate for her daughter, speaking out about the need for change. Her strength became a source of inspiration for those around her, a testament to the power of love and resilience in the face of unimaginable loss. But even as she fought for justice, The pain of Livye's absence was a constant companion. Every milestone, every memory was a reminder of what had been stolen from them. The search for Matthew was eventually reignited by a tip that placed him near his family's property. Law enforcement moved swiftly, coordinating a plan to bring him in. After nearly a year on the run, he was finally captured, ending a chapter of the story that had haunted Hemphill for far too long. For Darcy and Livye's loved ones, his arrest was a moment of vindication, a sign that justice was still possible. As Matthew was formally sentenced to 99 years in prison, the weight of the trial, the investigation, and the manhunt settled over the community. The fight for justice had been long and painful, but it had not been in vain. Livye's story had become more than just a tragedy. It was a call to action, a reminder of the importance of accountability and the strength of those who refuse to give up. The capture of Matthew Edgar brought a measure of relief to Hemphill, Texas, but the journey to this point had left deep scars. For nearly a year, the specter of his escape had loomed over the community. His recapture was a critical step toward closure, yet for those who had loved Livye Lewis, the pain of her loss remained as sharp as ever. The trial's verdict and his sentence of 99 years in prison were victories, but they could never undo the damage wrought on a young woman's life and the heart she left behind. As Matthew sat behind bars, Hemphill's residents reflected on the many questions that still lingered. How had a relationship filled with so much potential turned into a nightmare? Livye's story had revealed a darker side of love, one tainted by manipulation, control, and violence. It was a reminder that danger can hide behind a charming smile, that love without respect and kindness can devolve into obsession. Matthew's behavior leading up to Livye's death was a testament to how jealousy and possessiveness can spiral into something deadly when left unchecked. For Livye's family, the aftermath of the trial was a mix of grief, determination, and reflection. Darcy Bass, her mother, had been a pillar of strength throughout the ordeal. She had fought tirelessly for justice, enduring the trial, the heartbreak, and the uncertainty of Matthew's escape. But now she faced a different challenge: how to preserve Livye's memory in a way that honored her life rather than the circumstances of her death. Livye's friends and family channeled their grief into action. They shared her story widely, hoping it would serve as a warning to others in similar situations. They wanted people to recognize the signs of toxic relationships, to know that it is okay to walk away, and to understand the importance of seeking help. Livye's death was a tragedy, but her legacy could be one of education, empowerment, and change. Hemphill itself was forever altered by what had happened. The close-knit community, once a place where everyone felt safe, had been shaken to its core. People began to question how such violence could have gone unnoticed, how Matthew's actions could have escalated to such a tragic end without intervention. The town's small size, where everyone knew everyone's business, was both a blessing and a curse. In this case, familiarity may have bred complacency, allowing warning signs to be overlooked or dismissed as just part of a tumultuous relationship. The impact of Livye's murder extended far beyond Hemphill. Her story sparked conversations about domestic violence and the need for better resources to protect victims. Advocates called for changes in the legal system, including stricter monitoring of those released on bond and more thorough investigations of domestic abuse allegations. Livye's case was not an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a much larger problem that required collective action to address. In prison, Matthew remained a controversial figure. His lack of remorse during the trial and his attempt to escape justice left little room for sympathy. Yet there were still those who defended him, clinging to the belief that he was not capable of such a heinous act. The divide between those who saw him as a cold-blooded killer and those who believed he had been wrongfully accused mirrored the divisions that had existed in his and Livye's relationship, a tug-of-war between hope and despair, trust and betrayal. For Livye's younger siblings, her death was a wound that would take a lifetime to heal. They struggled to make sense of a world that could be so cruel, a world that had taken their sister away from them. Darcy made it her mission to keep Livye's memory alive for them, to remind them of the person she was before the tragedy. They remembered her laughter, her kindness, and the way she made everyone feel special. Livy had been more than a victim. She had been a light in their lives, and they clung to that light as they tried to move forward. The graveyard where Livy was laid to rest became a place of solace for her family and friends. Darcy, in particular, found herself drawn to the spot, tending to the flowers and the small mementos left by those who visited. She was determined to raise the money for a proper headstone, one that would reflect the vibrancy and beauty of her daughter's life. It was a small but significant way to honor her memory, to ensure that Livy's story would never be forgotten. Despite the pain, Darcy found moments of strength and hope. She spoke publicly about Livy's life, sharing her daughter's dreams and accomplishments with anyone who would listen. She wanted people to know the real Livy, not just the girl who had been taken too soon, but the remarkable young woman who had lived with purpose and compassion. Her voice became a rallying cry for change, a reminder that the fight against domestic violence and the pursuit of justice were battles worth waging. As the years passed, the community began to heal, though the scars of Livy's murder remained. Hemphill became a place of remembrance, a town that had learned the hard way about the consequences of silence and inaction. Livy's story inspired programs aimed at educating young people about healthy relationships, helping them recognize the signs of abuse, and empowering them to seek help when needed. Her legacy was one of awareness and advocacy, a testament to the impact one life can have, even in the face of unspeakable tragedy. Matthew's sentence of 99 years in prison was a stark reminder of the cost of his actions. While he would have the possibility of parole after 30 years, it was a lifetime away for a man who had once walked free among the people he had hurt. For Darcy and those who loved Livy, the sentence brought some measure of justice, but it could never bring her back. Their lives would always be marked by her absence, but they found solace in the knowledge that her death had not been in vain. In the end, Livy's story was one of resilience, not just her own, but that of her family, her friends, and her community. They had faced the worst and found a way to move forward, carrying her memory with them every step of the way. Her life, though tragically cut short, became a beacon of hope for others, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, love and strength can endure. As the town of Hemphill looked to the future, Livy's spirit remained a part of it, woven into the fabric of the community she had called home. Her laughter echoed in the memories of those who knew her. Her kindness lived on in the actions of those she inspired, and her story became a powerful reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of standing up for what is right. Livy Lewis may have been taken too soon, but her legacy would shine brightly for years to come.